This last lesson of the training, we're going to take a look at how we can use the view proxy objects and just having xStream integrated with Cinema and use those for dynamic interactions. I'm going to be using thinking particles for this and use the proxy objects and a couple of techniques for ecosystems to make those collisions and also emitters. So we're going to start out with a new scene. And I do want to note that, take a look, preferences, I have my basic unit set to meter for cinema. And I'm using an internal unit of 0.1 meters within view. My infinite plane geometry size is 500 meters. Let's go ahead and switch to our main camera. And we're just going to add a couple of objects. I'm going to use a standard terrain. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and remove that construction plane because we don't need to get much larger than the size we currently have. Make sure we're in the object mode to manipulate this terrain. And what I'm just going to do is have some kind of mountain areas towards the back. And these are going to be emitting particles onto another terrain. Okay, so now I'm going to add in a procedural terrain. We're going to go ahead and edit this object, get rid of zero edges, turning that mode off so that we have a nice flat terrain. And I'm going to go ahead and just turn down, I'm just using the default function that we have here, which is just a simple fractal with a seed, which is an origin or an offset of the position of the material. And this default should work fine. If you want to see the seed I'm using, if you want to match up, if you're working on your own scene, you can see those numbers are right here. Negative 946 on the X, negative 36 on the Y, and 136 on the Z. And I have my Z axis as the up axis in view, even though it's the Y in Cinema. So the rest of these settings are fine. Go ahead and click OK. I'm going to scale down on the up and down axis. And actually, I'm going to go ahead and edit this object, just reduce the scale a little more. I want to add a little more variation, maybe not that much. We'll do 0.4 for our scale. And this is the object parametric mode. I'm just going to take our ground and remove it from the OpenGL preview for now. And then we can take our terrain and our procedural terrain and just kind of move them up. And we'll go ahead and take that back terrain and scale it up just a little larger and reduce scale on some of the other axes. Take our procedural terrain, and I am going to scale this down just a little bit more. Move that in closer, and I just want to make sure these are intersecting. Okay, so now I want to assign some materials really quick. Change the object material for that back terrain, and I'm going to go to landscapes. Or actually, I'll go to material layers and just select the large scale rock. And we'll make the procedural terrain, change the object material, and I'm going to use the large scale pale grass, which should work out fine. I'm not going to pay too much attention to the materials just because I really want to pay attention and focus on sort of the interactions with the proxies and what we need to do in order to get them to work properly with the scene. And now I'm also going to add an ecosystem to the terrain. And it's not going to work as a direct collision, and really none of the proxies will. We do have to modify them slightly. Go ahead and edit the object material of our procedural terrain. But there's kind of a cool technique that I came up with for making collision objects to match the ecosystem, or at least really close to it, and add some different variations. I'm going to add in a plant, and I just want something really fast loading right now. I'm not going to worry about the details, so I'm just going to add in a maple tree. And now I want to just set up a basic density. I'm going to load in, just use a noise node that we have, and I am going to use just one of the filters I've made. It's part of Snowflake. It's called Gradient Threshold. You can use brightness and contrast to sharpen the edges, maybe a threshold filter as well. But I really like the way this one can turn out. And I'm going to hit populate, and we're just going to take a look at the ecosystem and see how it looks. And we need to make sure that we're able to view all of those instances. And it looks like I do want to edit that material, increase density, and see how that looks. I'm going to go ahead and increase the size of that function for the density, just increasing the scale of the noise so we get some larger patches. And every once in a while you might get a message saying that it's going to require a lot of instances. In this case, it wasn't right. That calculation was wrong. If you create a density beforehand and you really only make a change to the scale of a density rather than adjusting and scaling objects down smaller and really increasing amounts, you shouldn't have to worry about messages like that. So I just want to make sure that this is intersecting all the way. I'm going to go back and select our standard terrain. And another thing I want to note is that there is a decay near foreign objects option in the density for ecosystem population. At the moment, Cinema 4D objects do not affect this decay amount. So you will have to use objects in place within view in order to get that to work correctly. And I think I just want to make this ecosystem, at least the plants, slightly larger. I don't want to work with too large of a scene right now. Just something to make it a little more obvious what's going to happen. And if they're too small, then the collisions we end up creating might not show up as well. Okay, we're going to start by creating our emitter object. And what I want to use is this standard terrain and use some of the polygons from it in order to create an emitter. The proxy object itself is not going to work for this, at least not the one connected to the view volumetric. We do need to modify and basically make it editable, and then there's a couple other things that have to be done in order for it to work, especially for collision objects. But because making an object editable and turning it into polygons will actually delete the object from view, we first need to copy and paste it. So we can, making sure we're using the view copy and paste, I have mine set up for the right mouse click menu, and now we have a copy of that terrain. We can go ahead and make it editable. So now it's no longer in the view scene. And what we can also do is delete any tags that are created for it because we don't need them. And we don't want any duplicate materials. The procedural terrain, we're going to do the same thing with. Go ahead and copy and then paste. And it looks like what it did was just create another copy of the standard terrain. It's possible that I have the wrong command for copy. I'm going to go ahead and double check and just select the procedural terrain, edit, copy, edit, paste, and it looks like it's doing the same thing. So at the moment, it looks like there is a slight bug with copying and pasting procedural terrains within xStream. So the way to get around this, I'm first going to just save the scene where it's at and open in standalone view. And we can just perform the action here. We're going to take our procedural terrain, copy and paste it, and now we have a duplicate. It's called Procedural Terrain 1. We can save the scene, close out standalone view, and reload scene from file. And now that new terrain is going to show up, we can go ahead and make it editable and drag it out of the volumetric and delete any tags attached. Because I did reload, it refreshed the materials, so I'm going to select our objects, edit the object material, just click OK to close it out, just to regenerate those colors. And then I'm going to save the scene again. So this procedural terrain is going to be our collision. Just name it terrain collision. And the standard terrain is going to be our terrain emitter. So we're going to start with editing the emitter. And all I really want are a few groups of polygons around the terrain. We don't need to use the entire object. Doing so would be a little bit too much. I really just want to grab from some random places around this terrain. And the first thing that needs to be done is the normals need to be inverted. If we go to the polygon mode and just use the live selection tool, we're going to take a look, and you can see the normals are pointing the wrong direction. If we go underneath, in order to see that better, all of the normals within a proxy point the wrong way, which could be some of the reasons why the proxy objects themselves don't work. At least for collisions but there's a couple other problems with them as well. We'll see that in a minute. So what I'm going to do with the structure, actually go to functions, and we're going to reverse the normals. So now we can go in and select them and see that they are showing up correctly. The next thing we need to do, go ahead and deselect the polygons. I'm just going to run and optimize, and then I'm going to add in a connect object. This is going to be one of the most important operations for getting this to work, more so with the collision object than the emitter, because the emitter itself doesn't really need to be extremely precise, but the collision will not work at all without doing this operation. So we're going to take the terrain emitter, and I'm going to copy the name, replace the connect object name, drag that into the connect object, make it editable, which resets our scale, and also will, surprisingly enough, correct our polygons. So now we should be able to just pull out what we need. I'm going to go ahead and switch to the top view, and I'm going to cut off a few areas here. So we're going to make sure we're in the polygon mode. I'm going to use the rectangle selection tool, turn off only select visible elements, and first select this side, just delete it, and it might leave behind points, and it did. So what I want to do is, after I cut all the polygons, select the group that's connected and then invert it to delete the rest of them. Delete the sides here, and you can just take a look in the main camera view to see what we have left. And then I'm going to go from the front view and just cut out a lot of these polygons on the bottom, because we don't need nearly this much information. But I do like having the ability to just use the terrain in case you wanted a more precise shot. And I'm going to go in with the live selection tool and just cut out some more. Make sure I turn off only visible elements. And I just want to leave myself with a few dots of polygons and a few little patches we can use. Okay, so now we can go back into the main camera view and just kind of trim some more, add some holes to make it look a little more interesting. Make sure I turn the enhanced OpenGL mode on. And we're still getting a little bit of flicker, but that's because we've got overlapping objects. So for now, we can just turn off that terrain collision object. Okay, that should be good. Get rid of some of the strays. And I'm going to select all these groups, and then we're going to go up to selection, and we are going to select connected. And now I'm going to use the convert selection tool and go from polygons to points, convert, and now under selection we can invert and then hit delete. And that's going to get rid of all those stray points that we don't need. And this object is pretty much done. So we now have our emitter. Just going to set it so that it doesn't render. Get rid of that Fong shader that was added to it. So we're going to set up just using preset. So I'm going to go to File, Load Object Preset, Thinking Particles, Emitter, and use the Surface Emitter. And I'm also going to create a null object and just call it TP underscore group underscore 1. And it looks like I hit caps lock in there. So we'll grab our surface emitter, and in the thinking particles section, our polygon surface will be the terrain emitter. And then we can drag the emitter into the surface emitter, and then drag both of those into the group 1. And we're going to start to see some particles being generated from that surface. But we are going to need to make a few modifications. I'll go ahead and just save this really quick. So I'm also going to add in an effector, and I'm going to select planar gravity. We can drag that into our group. And if I turn up the strength, we'll be able to see that a little bit better. We'll be making more modifications to this once we start to get some of the other objects set up. So I'm going to select the terrain collision, and we'll show that in the OpenGL now. I'm going to go select polygon mode, structure, and actually we'll go over to function, and just first I'm going to optimize it, just using the default settings. Whether or not this is actually doing much of anything, I'm not quite sure. I haven't really gone in and analyzed the points. It's just something I like to do just to make sure. I have found that sometimes if I don't do it, the collision doesn't work right. So I'll just run that first, and then another thing is to, of course, reverse the normals. So if we go in here and select, we'll see the normals are now facing the correct direction. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is create another connect object. I'm just going to copy the name over. I am going to deselect, get out of the polygon mode, copy the name, paste it onto the connect object so we don't have to rename it, and then drag this object into the connect object, make it editable, delete the Phong shader because we don't need it. And now we have our collision basically set up. And it has reset our size and hopefully fixed any of our polygon problems. If you don't use a connect object, what pretty much ends up happening is as the particles start to collide with the object, they will show up in just random places all over the scene and kind of despawn in one place and spawn in another. So things can get very interesting without this little operation performed to the proxy. So now we can add in another object preset, and we're going to use interactions, object collision. We'll go ahead and drag that into our group. And our collision, go to the thinking particles section, and just drag our terrain into there. And now we can just connect that, moving it under. And we shouldn't really see much of anything until we set up these particles a bit more, because they're really erratic, and we're going to need to adjust the emitter. One thing I'm going to do is set up a layer, the TP group layer, and then just to be sure, add all of these to that layer, even though just adding the main group should take care of it. I just want to be sure. And then for our particle group, I'm just going to drag the main null object just to set this up if I was to do anything a little more advanced with this setup. Okay, so now I'm going to go to the emitter, and so we can see what's going on a little bit better. I'm going to increase the particle number up to, let's just start with 1,000. And I'm going to increase the mass and decrease our size. And so that I can see the scale a little better, I'm going to go up to Objects, Thinking Particles, and select the Thinking Particle settings. For our view type, I'm going to set it to flakes. And that way we can see the scale a little bit better. So we can go ahead and turn that down, add a little size variation and mass variation. And now we're going to go over to our gravity. We can increase the strength. I'm going to go back to the emitter and turn down our speed, something a little lower. And we can already see these particles interacting with that collision object. We do want to make sure the collision is not rendering, and we don't really need to see it in the OpenGL anymore because we still have our main procedural terrain underneath it, and that will pretty much take care of the display. And we can turn off the emitter as well, at least the geometry for it. So I'm going to go back to the emitter and turn down size down to 4. And I want to edit the collision, increasing the surface amount. And what that will do is make the particles stick to the surface a little more and kind of conform to it. And then the bounce amount I'm going to turn up, just turn down surface slightly, and then add a little bit of the chaos to kind of vary it. So it looks pretty good so far. One more thing I want to do with gravity is go to the coordinates, and right now we have it set at 100 or negative 90 degrees. I'm going to set this to negative 110, and that's going to add a little bit of an offset to the direction. So if we take a look at this gravity object, we can see where that's going to show up and what direction they're going to be moving to. So I'm going to sort of force the particles in the direction of the terrain. And I want to slow down that speed once again, but what we could also do is go to the surface emitter, or actually the collision first, and under the advanced settings we have the ability to add friction. So we'll go ahead and just take a look and see how far everything is extending. And then the energy will reduce the energy and basically slow down our objects. You can add a little bit of bounce variation and add some spin. And I'm going to go back to the emitter, turn down our size even smaller, turn down the speed, and reduce our speed even more. And now we can increase the particle number. Go ahead and bring that up to 2000. And now we can see that nice interaction with the terrain. We may need to decrease the surface so that we can add a little more bounce and have it sort of separate a little more from the terrain. We could also increase chaos. And I'm going to turn down energy, friction, just see how that looks. Because those settings seem to really impact the overall output of this. So rather than sitting here and tweaking for the rest of the training, I'm going to go with this, with what we have, and we're going to take a look at how you can create collision objects for the ecosystem, because right now all of these particles are just going to go right through it, because the proxies themselves are image proxies there to represent the object. The actual geometry is not there, and placing that geometry there is not a good idea, because it's going to be a very large polygon count. For this, we do need to go to the standalone version. I'm going to save, and we're going to go File, Open Scene in Standalone. And I will not actually be modifying or saving this scene or any changes to it. The object that I'm going to end up with, or objects, depending on the detail that we end up needing, I'm going to go ahead and save out and then load in. So what we want to do is create an object to basically fill in or stand out where these trees are. There's a couple of different ways we can do this, and I came up with a way that seems to work pretty well and is also fairly versatile. The detail can be increased, and it's actually really quick and easy to set up. So the first thing I want to do is we're going to create a replacement object for all of these maple trees. This would also be for any ecosystem you had, any objects. If you also had actual objects, then you might have to use some different sort of setup. But for right now, for trees, this should work pretty well. It's going to ask me if I want to automatically populate this sphere. I'm going to select no and reset the material on the sphere because I don't want the previous material or object that was selected to apply its material to the new object, which was the procedural terrain with the ecosystem, and we don't want that on the sphere. What we need to do is save the sphere out. First thing I want to do is just stretch it out a little bit on what I have as my z-axis, the up and down axis. And it's not really the shape of a tree, but it's pretty close. At least enough for any sort of dynamic interaction this large of a scale. I'm going to reduce that slightly. We can modify this shape more later. I am going to open up the material editor and replace this material name that is called material because I reset it with collision. And we should go ahead and call this tree underscore eco underscore collision. And now what we need to do is save this object out. And I'm going to call this sphere underscore replace eco. Copy, paste, just to copy the file name over the title. We can save this out. Preview doesn't really matter. And once this is saved, you can either keep it in the scene, but I'm just going to delete it. No sense in having it if we're not really going to use it. And now what we need to do is basically replace all of these trees with that sphere. And adding that sphere or even modifying the material for the ecosystem could reposition exactly where the trees are at. Now, because we have a density function basically defining the outline, for the most part it should match up even if it was repopulated. But if I want the closest possible match right now with a standard populated ecosystem, as we're not using dynamic population for this, and what I'm going to do is open up the ecosystem painter. I'm going to add in an object, and then I can load from file, or use the browse file command. And here's that sphere replace eco. Once that's loaded in, we can just close this out. Now we want to use the ecosystem selector. And we're going to select all. It's going to select every single tree. If you need to define specific areas, you can paint on the terrain or paint in the scene to select which trees you want. If there's a group you do not want to be part of the collision, then you can deselect it. I'm just going to select all of this. We're going to go to manipulate, and we're going to change the instance type to sphere replace eco. It's automatically going to match our size to the current sizes of the instance. Because in a way, the instance data is kind of like particle data. It has size information and position information and also rotation. And I also want to note that this may take a little while depending on how many trees you have. Back to what I was saying before about the amount of geometry it would take to actually take all of these trees and put them in Cinema. At the moment, this scene is 16 million polygons, almost 17, and most of those are the ecosystem. So that's going to cause some huge lag within Cinema, and mainly because View is just displaying them as our billboards, but even as geometry, it can still handle it a little bit more. So we're just going to wait a sec, and I'm going to wait for this to finish up. Basically, the operation, it doesn't really seem to have any sort of a progress bar that I've seen. So what I've been able to look at is the select ecosystem instance tool, which is currently grayed out, and we can also still see the instances selected. So I'm just going to wait for this to finish up. If you are only doing a very small portion to have this collision, which I probably should have done since the back of the terrain really isn't going to matter as much, you could reduce the selection or just select some of the stuff directly in front of the camera. Obviously, it depends on the shot. In this case, I just want to kind of show you a broader range of what is possible. So we're just going to wait for this to update, and then I'll show you how we can size stuff. Okay, in this case, it was a matter of getting the OpenGL to refresh. What I did was just went to edit the material and clicked on paint for the ecosystem, and it has automatically added in that sphere replace eco underneath the maple, but all we see are the spheres. I'm just going to go ahead and hit cancel, but all those objects are showing up, but it's still not geometry. So what we need to do is go back to the ecosystem selector, and we have 419 spheres. That might be a little bit too much for this scene. So what I'm going to do is just select the front objects, and we can see exactly how many are selected. 71 out of 419. I'm just going to grab the front groups, and we're going to do about half. That's just going to speed up performance, and we really don't need a lot of the other ones. So now what I want to do is go to Manipulate and Convert to Objects. And that actually went really smoothly. I'm going to go back into the selector and select all and convert those to objects as well. Sometimes there can be a bit of a lag when doing that because there's so many objects, but really that wasn't that many, and it went very quickly. So now what I want to do is select all of these spheres, start with the top sphere, go all the way down to the bottom, holding down the Shift key, select, and we want to switch our scaling to local. And under display, I have gizmos turned on, and I'm using the scale gizmo. Once I'm in local mode, it is going to scale all of these objects from their pivot and not from a global or sort of calculated pivot. So if we want to make these larger or smaller, we can. If we want to stretch them up on a specific axis, we can easily do that. We can flatten them, really do whatever you want to manipulate them. The view sphere is a very simple object and is recognized by itself very easily. So that's one of the reasons why we're able to copy and paste so many of them. Another operation that works well with this is being able to move these down if needed or rotate them. So if you want, you could actually rotate all of these around their own pivot. So depending on the object you have or the amount of variation you want to create, you can really manipulate these spheres to kind of do what you want. Okay, and now for the part that is going to combine all this together. Now we can either keep these as they are, converting and baking them to polygons, but if you want to work on something in a little bit of a larger of a section, what we can do is create a metablob. Go over here on the left, select Create Metablob Object. It's going to fuse all these together, and it's just like metaballs or any of the similar technologies where it kind of adaptively subdivides a skin around a bunch of given objects. And we can edit this object, right mouse click, and go to Edit Object, and we can adjust the envelope distance. And there's a preview that does show up if you're using newer versions of Vue. It might take a second to calculate, but we can increase that distance and really kind of blob this stuff together. Like I said, you could also just kind of keep the objects the way they are. If you want to match more trees that are kind of separated from themselves, but if you want to just do groups, then the metablob works well. It's also a way to paint with metablobs, which is kind of cool. You can also use a combination of the two together if needed. You could just combine the metablob with basically low poly or baked versions of the spheres, or you could just stick with the metablob, which is a more simple collision object. I'm going to go ahead and copy this metablob and paste it, and I'm going to ungroup one of the metablobs, reselect all of those spheres that just came out of it, group them, And first, let's just go ahead and take care of this metablob object. I'm going to right mouse click, bake it to polygons. And if we take a look at the estimated number of polygons and vertices, it's not always super accurate. Since we are using, of course, view objects, it is a little bit closer. Let's just go ahead and try something here and see how that turns out. That's way too low poly. So I'm going to undo that and select bake. And it's just a good idea to start with a low number and just slowly work your way up until you get to where you need to go, instead of immediately creating something that's just ridiculous. So this needs to go even higher. Undo. And we're going to go back and bake it once again, going further and further up the bake quality. And that's getting a little bit closer to what we need, but we're going to fill in the rest with this group object, which we are also going to bake to polygons. And I'm going to set this to a fairly low number. And that looks like it was a little too much. I want a lot less geometry because we don't need a whole lot of polygons from this. And that should be pretty good. So we've got our meta blob and our group. Take those two objects, and it looks like the meta blob is rendering correctly within the view. Whether or not there's a problem with the polygons, I'm not quite sure. It could just be a display error, or what is selected for its view mode. And it looks like it's set to wireframe, set that to smooth shade, and now it's fine. So we can take these two objects, and you can save them out separately if you want to set different types of collisions to the smaller separated objects rather than the blobs. But I'm going to go ahead and just group them together, bake them to polygons, and because there's no adaptive resolution, we just get one fixed amount. If you do need to increase the resolution after you've already baked them, you can edit the object and use the dynamic subdivision, which will increase the resolution and give you the ability to subdivide, which is pretty cool. So what we can do is just save this object. Just going to call it eco replacement. And we'll just leave that. We don't really need to worry about texture maps or compressing the file, but I'll just keep them on. Just in case there's any problems, I'm going to save out the scene as a separate file because we are not saving it. And now back in Cinema, what we can do is go to the main menu, object, and what we're going to do is load an object from file, and we'll just have to find the directory where we saved it. And there's our object. We can go ahead and open that up. And we're going to see where that's showing up, and it looks like it does need to be moved. So what we could do is just move it up to match. And it looks like there's a little bit of a position offset just because the object looked like it recentered itself. Maybe it was based on where I was editing before, or possibly what was selected before. But you can take a look and see that these pretty much match up with all of our objects. We do need to perform the same operation now because this is still a proxy. But I did think that this was the easiest way to make sure the scales were consistent. So what we want to do is copy the object, paste it, and now make it editable. You can pull that out, delete all the tags, and we're going to create a connect object. We also need to check the normals, and they are all facing the opposite direction. So functions, reverse normal, and put that into our connect object. Call this eco collision. And now we can make it editable. Delete the Phong shader because we don't really need it. You can use it to control some operations. In this case, I'm not going to be using it. And basically you now have two options. You can either create another collision object, one that is going to collide and make the particles react differently with the ecosystem than with the terrain, which would be more realistic, and you could create some very interesting effects that way. Or what you could do is go back to the connect object and use that to combine the terrain collision along with the eco collision. So either way is going to work. You're definitely going to have more flexibility with the scene if you keep them separated. Of course, if you do run into any problems, you may need to kind of combine those together. One thing I'm going to do is just take our current collision object and copy and paste it. We can delete the terrain collision, put the eco in there, and then move our eco collision as the collision object. Bring that into our group. And I'm going to turn off the preview and make sure that it's not rendering. And we can also delete the eco replacement object from the scene. So now we're going to see a nice interaction around all of our trees. And we get a lot more detail that way within the scene. I'm going to go ahead and save this. And I just want to add a little more modification to this object collision. I'm going to basically decrease the energy, the friction, increase the spin, increase bounce variation, really increase the bounce amount, and decrease surface, increase chaos. And we should notice a different reaction when colliding with the terrain and colliding with the eco collision object. So we may also want to turn off or down the surface to a really low amount. And that way we can bounce off the trees. And if you need to create more detail, you could use a higher res object. You could also subdivide what you currently have, maybe make modifications to it. And now I've just made a couple of modifications to some of the settings, and I'm just going to scrub through. And basically what I did was just decrease surface amounts and increase the bounce. Removed almost all friction from the trees. And of course, as we can see, increased the particle amount by quite a lot. So if you need to add, obviously, some more effectors for the particles to maybe group them around the trees, obviously there's a ridiculous amount of control you have with thinking particles. Of course, these collision objects and this technique can be used to make collision objects for the other dynamic systems within Cinema. So I hope you have learned a little bit about using xStream and Cinema together, and kind of figured out some of the stuff you can do with it. It obviously has a lot of power. It's just a matter of sometimes knowing exactly how to correct certain situations and knowing what's broken. And hopefully we can see some more good things coming from future updates.